Okay, I'm going to summarize some of the things we did yesterday. I think we had quite a few digressions. I don't think I remember all of them. And we'll see if we're together, and then I'll try to finish up this idea. We started with what I call the Euthyphro problem, which was first publicized by Plato. And as I said yesterday, I'm not a Plato scholar. I'm not doing Plato scholarship. I'm formulating it in a way that we can make use of it. And maybe I can sharpen up the formulation just a little bit. He said, assume, this was what they assumed, that the things that are right, good, and just, things that are moral, are in fact all the things that the gods love. So they're identical. Now he said, which way is it? Is it that the gods loving them makes them moral? Or is it that the gods love them because they're moral? Which one causes the other? Does the gods' love cause these things to be moral? Or is it that these things are moral that causes the gods to love it? I think you put the same question in slightly different words, and maybe it's a little more intuitive. What makes things moral? Well, there are only two possibilities. Either the gods' love makes them moral, or it doesn't, and something else does. So, if it's the gods' love that makes them moral, that's one half of the equation. If something else makes them moral, then presumably the gods love those things because they're moral. That's what motivates them. But really, the heart of the question is, does the gods' love make it moral, or does something else do it? And something else does it, then you understand it. The things that are moral in and of themselves, and the gods love them because they're moral. And Plato says, and I expressed at least part of the idea, that whatever you say, you're in trouble. In particular, if you say it's the gods' love that makes them moral, you have to imagine that the gods loved something else, like murder or torture, that would make it moral. And that's hard to swallow. If you say that things are moral for some other reason, something else makes them moral in and of themselves, then that seems to deprive God of any moral authority. His saying so means nothing as to whether something's right or wrong or good or bad, because being right or wrong or good or bad is found in some other way entirely, having nothing to do with him. Now, I caution that whenever someone says it's it A or B, in the back of your mind you ought to think, are those the only two alternatives? And I suggested that I'm going to be offering an alternative, which you can think of as a kind of compromise, that some things are moral independently of God making them so, certainly not God's love making them so, and other things might be moral because God wants them, loves them, says them. So you'll have to split the field. And part of the frustration with the question is that it looks like it's either all one or all the other, and it's hard to adjudicate it that way. That's what I'm going to suggest. So now, when the objection to saying it's God's love or God's command, comes out to be the same thing, makes it so, is that you then have to struggle with the idea that God could make murder moral by wanting it, loving it, or commanding it. And that seems hard to digest. I pointed out, not only is it hard to digest intuitively, but if you're considering this question in the context of a Jewish religious position, the Jewish religious position doesn't allow it. The Jewish religious position does not allow the idea that whatever God would command, whatever God would want, whatever God would love would automatically become moral. That's not the Jewish position. I illustrated that with Abraham's response to God's informing him that God is going to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham understands God to mean they're all going down the drain, period, no matter what. So Abraham says, you can't do that. That's not justice. Shall the judge of all the earth not do justice? Shall your anger destroy the righteous together with the wicked? And nowhere in the Jewish tradition is Abraham reprimanded. Abraham, you forgot your lessons from Philosophy 101, God is God. He doesn't need your approval. Whatever he says is right because he said so. No one takes that position. And God agrees with him. They're certainly not going to destroy the righteous together with the wicked. Similarly, there is a problem throughout Jewish literature of the suffering of the righteous or suffering of the innocent. The book of Job is very largely dedicated to that question. According to our tradition, the book of Job was written by Moses. So it goes all the way back. What's the problem? How can we explain the suffering of the righteous? You think, well, they're righteous, so they don't deserve to suffer. Yeah, but the suffering is coming from divine providence. That's why we're raising the problem to God. So why isn't the answer, you're asking the wrong authority, the question. If God ordains that they should suffer, the suffering's right. It's good. It is just because, you see, God's in charge. And he's the author of justice, and he makes it any way he wants. No one takes that position. No one. The usual answers are, he only looks righteous. He isn't really righteous. You don't know his whole private life. Certainly not his inner spiritual life. Or, yes, maybe he's righteous, but the suffering contributes to some future benefit, which makes it worthwhile. But the conditional proposition, if he really is righteous, and if the suffering is not going to do him any good, then it's wrong for him to suffer, is not challenged. That's correct. And then the complaint is, if he really is righteous, and if the suffering is not going to give him some benefit, then you, God, would be wrong to do that. That's the challenge. And nowhere do you have the answer. Come on, God can't be wrong. By definition, what he does is right. That's not the answer. So the idea that the Creator can just by wishing it, desiring it, approving of it, or commanding it, make anything right and anything wrong, is not something which the Jewish tradition accepts. So we're not talking now about ancient Greek gods. We're not talking about world religions, but we're talking about Judaism. In the Jewish context, we're not going to accept the idea that God has open-ended, unlimited moral authority to make just anything right and anything wrong. There is a book which some people think the Ramchal wrote, and other people think maybe it was a student of his, called the Klach Pischei Chochmah, where he wants to illustrate what we would consider a creation coming from God and how we would evaluate it. Now, I'm taking, it's his idea, I'm just using my own example of it. But imagine a whole world, a whole universe that has only one thing in it. One thing, and that one thing stays the same forever. Nothing else ever happens. And that one thing is a toothache. Just toothache forever. Not toothache in prayer, and not toothache in justice, and not toothache in charity, and not toothache which is relieved, and not toothache that inspires someone to a higher spiritual side. Just toothache. Toothache forever. I don't think you can make a peace with that. We're not going to accept that. Because that would be just pure evil. pure evil, serving no good purpose, and being totally unjustified. So that being the case, this idea that God's wanting it, desiring it, preferring it, or commanding it makes it good or evil is something that we can't accept. If so, it seems, according to the Euthyphro, we're thrown to the other possibility, that is, whatever makes things right and good and just and moral is whatever it is. Who knows what it is? And then God tells us what He tells us, commands us, informs us, and leads us in ways that are moral, because He's a moral being and He's going to follow the laws of morality, but it ends up that God has no moral authority. He just does what He does because of the independently existing nature of morality. And He has no moral authority. Now, that part we got yesterday. And someone asked a question, and I started to answer it. I'm not going to answer it now, but I just want to mention it to put it on the side. This has nothing to do with God's creating it. It'd be perfectly all right if He created it. We're talking about His wanting it, His preferring it, His prioritizing it, His commanding it. Creating it is something else entirely. Creating it means He creates it with its nature, its character, its reality, and He just makes it be. So it would be perfectly consistent to say God created it, but it is what it is because it is what it is. I'll give you an example. God created wood. Without God's creation, there wouldn't be any wood. But wood is what it is. God couldn't create wood as a gas because wood is a solid. It isn't a gas. He created a gas instead of wood. That He could do. Sure, doesn't have to make wood. Nobody's telling Him what to do. God can't create Beethoven as a squirrel because Beethoven wasn't a squirrel. He could not create Beethoven and create a squirrel instead. He could create a squirrel and call it Beethoven, but he can't take the composer Beethoven and create him as a squirrel because he isn't a squirrel. Similarly, this is what's called, for the aficionados, metaphysical necessity. This table, this wooden table, right? Let's say God created it out of nothing. There's God's factory, and these tables come spewing out of the factory because God's creating them and delivering them free of charge to mankind, okay? Now this table, could God have created this table out of metal? If it had been metal, it wouldn't be this table, because this table is made out of wood. He could have decided not to create this table and created a metal table instead, a metal table with the same color, a metal table with the same shape, maybe a metal table with the same weight, but because that table is metal and this table is wood, they aren't the same table. It's some other table in place of this table. Because one of the things about an object that makes it what it is its composition. So, you talk about morality, I'm inclined to think that everything's created by God, morality and mathematics and everything else, though it's hard to explain how, but I'm inclined to take that position. But it doesn't follow that God could make murder morally right. That doesn't follow. Morality is what it is. God could decide to make it or not make it. He could make something else in place of it. Certainly could. He's all-powerful. But morality is what it is, and one of the rules of morality is that cold-blooded murder is wrong. So He can bring it into existence or not bring it into existence, but it has its own definition. It has its own character. Just like the Rambam in Part 1, Chapter 50 of the Guide says, he has a bitter critique of Christianity and then of certain Jews in a parallel way. He says, some Christians will tell you that deity is three and it's one, and it's both one and three, because 1 is 3 and 3 is 1. And Maimonides says these are people who are interested in knowing what words to say, but they're not interested in knowing what ideas to think. Because behind the words, it is 1 and it is 3, and 3 is 1 and 1 is 3. Behind those words, no thought at all. It's just empty words. And then he says, Jews facing the problem that we have many descriptions of God, many qualities that we ascribe to God, and our tradition tells us that God is 1 in every respect. No number other than 1 ever applies to him in any respect whatsoever. And they are challenged by the idea that there are 62 different qualities that God has. So why doesn't 62 apply? And the answer is as follows. You're right. It's 62 qualities, 62 different qualities. But in God, the 62 is 1. You're saying the same thing the Christians are saying. Sorry, 62 isn't 1, and 1 isn't 62, and putting it in God in front of it is not going to change that. Again, you're saying the words that make you happy, but you're not expressing a thought because there's no thought behind it. So, similarly, suppose, and by the way, this has nothing to do specifically with God. I don't know how chess came into existence, but imagine a committee got together and they decided to create a game. They called it chess with all these rules. And then it catches on and people are playing it. Somebody says, this was a committee. They didn't have to do what they did. They could have created chess differently. For example, they could have created chess. Now, when he says chess, he means our game. They could have created chess to be played on horseback in shallow streams with a lead ball in the stream and carrying wooden lances, and the goal is to push this ball upstream or downstream. They could have created chess that way. I don't think that's quite right. They could have not created chess and created this game with the lead ball in the stream. Instead, they could have done that, right? But they couldn't have created this game of chess to be played on with lances and horses in a stream pushing a piece of lead up, because it isn't this game. It's a different game. So there are things that have their own definition, and God being all-powerful and the Creator can decide to bring them into existence or not, and bring other things into existence in place of them or not. He certainly has. But once you tell me it's this that He's creating, then this has its definition. And if you say to me, He creates this and gives it the qualities of that, then you're just contradicting yourself and you're saying words that have no meaning. So the same thing's true with morality. God creates morality. He makes it exist. It's morality because it has a rule that murder is wrong. That's one of the rules of morality. You say, well, He could have created morality with a rule saying that murder is right. That's not the correct description. The correct description is He could have decided not to create morality, and He could have created something else. And murder could have been something that's very attractive or very pleasant or very productive, make a lot of money from it. We can't create a rule that morality is morally right, because that's not one of the rules of morality. That's just not what morality is. Yeah, you have a question?
I had a question, but I think you answered it. I was following mostly the argument, but my question would be, did God then create all of those definitions intrinsic to all of these things that we're talking about in nature?
100%. The answer would be yes, He created all the definitions. And in place of that, He could have created different definitions. And that definitions would have given you different concepts. What you won't say is that this concept of chess, He could have created as being water polo, because it wouldn't be chess. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Okay, so now I said that instead of saying that there are two choices, either morality is what it is in and of itself, and God subscribes to it because He's a moral being and simply lives up to it, or He wants it, He likes it, He prefers it, He loves it, and that's what makes it right. Both of those are wrong because they're too extreme. I claim that there's a hybrid process, that part of morality is indeed independent of God's wanting it, liking it, commanding it, prioritizing it, He created it, but that's something else. That is independent. But then, through the part that's independent of his liking it and prioritizing it and all the rest, through that, given the way God relates to the world, he acquires certain moral authority, and after he acquires moral authority, some things that he merely likes, wants, prioritizes, and commands become moral because he says so, because he's acquired moral authority. So, in half of the picture, the moral rules are independent, that is to say, independent of his liking it, prioritizing it, wanting it, and commanding it. They are what they are. He created them, but they are what they are. Then he acts in a certain way. The rule says, aha, you did those things, so now you have the authority to give certain types of commands to people. And then when he gives the command, that new command becomes binding, and had he given a different command, the different command would have been binding. So, let's take the example we used yesterday. Gratitude as a moral responsibility is independent of God's commanding it, wanting it, liking it, and so forth and so on. It's a created part of morality, independent of his, so to speak, attitudes. And that means when anybody benefits someone, the recipient has a moral obligation to respond. Big benefits, little benefits. God's benefit is enormous. So there is, because of the independent moral requirement of paying debts of gratitude, God gets the authority to command within the limits of the debt of gratitude. Now, as it is, God says, one of the things I want from you is a half hour every morning with leather straps and leather boxes. Speaking to the men. So, okay, leather straps and leather boxes for a half hour. Gives me my life, my health, and everything else. Is that within the limits of the debt? Now, if you're an American, you probably have a serious doubt here. Don't tell me what to do. Don't push me around. Let me lead my own life. But if you're sane and level-headed, which does exclude the Americans, you think, okay, a half hour with leather straps and boxes, yeah, that's probably within the limits of the debt. Then because God said, I want you to do that, it becomes morally binding. Now, careful. How does the because work? Well, it's a long story. God said it, and God gives me enormous benefits, and there's an independent moral principle of paying your debts. So then, since I received all these benefits, I have an obligation to pay my debts. And now God says, I want you to pay the debt in part by using the leather straps and boxes. That's the story from which it comes out that God has the moral authority to tell me to wear tefillin. And if he had told me to jump through hoops instead, or weave baskets, I would have been responsible to do that. It's an open-ended moral authority up to the limits of the debt. So God does have moral authority, but it's delivered to him by these initial external moral principles. That's the picture that I told you, I believe I learned this from John Stuart Mill. Yeah.
What do you mean by debt? By debt to God and repaying the debt?
This has nothing particular to do with God. This moral principle is completely neutral. Any person who does something for me, I have a moral debt to him if he has a need to help him satisfy his need. Let me give you a brutal example to make this, I think, as clear as possible. I'm drowning in the river and George saves my life. 3 weeks later, George comes to me and says, I need to borrow $5,000. Can you help me? Simultaneously, a neighbor from down the street comes to me and says, I need to borrow $5,000. Can you help me out? I have exactly $5,000 to lend, and I flip a coin. Is that okay? Is that morally neutral? I don't think so. George saved my life, and the other fellow lives down the street. If I only have $5,000 to lend, I shouldn't flip a coin, I should give it to George. I owe him because he saved my life. That's a moral debt that I have. If I flip a coin, I'm doing something that's immoral. So that's one way to see the idea of the moral debt of gratitude. Somebody benefits me in a certain way, then I have a certain moral debt to him. So morality then would dictate that I should give him preference. Now, I did mention yesterday, I do want it to be on record, something that you should think about. This means the distinction I grew up on in American Reform, that there are two types of commandments. There are moral commandments and there are ritual commandments. Moral commandments like give charity and pursue justice and don't steal and so forth and so on. Don't slander. And the ritual commandments like wearing tefillin or keeping Shabbos or not eating pigs or whatever you like. And the implication of the distinction was moral commandments are very important because if you violate a moral commandment, you're immoral, and that's not nice. Whereas if you violate a ritual commandment, then you're not a ritual, and that's sort of, take it or leave it. So who cares whether you're a ritual or not? So that's dead wrong, because what it leaves out is that we have a moral relationship to God. So when God says to put on tefillin, and I know I have a moral debt of gratitude to him, then putting on tefillin becomes a moral commandment. The ritual commandments become moral commandments. That's what we got to yesterday, yeah.
In the case that someone seems to clearly do something good for me, but not without my asking. So for instance, the case you gave with George, that he helped save my life. 3 weeks later he comes and he asks for a favor or so on, and you tell George, I actually wanted to drown there. And then you change the case so that you don't really owe him in your mind because he didn't help you forward your benefit. And I kind of, when the Israeli people, the Jewish people say, we liked it in Mitzrayim, when they do that, it feels kind of like that move, like they're undermining their obligation to Hashem by saying that he didn't really help them. He took them out of a circumstance that they were happy with.
Okay, look, this is a little, I think, it's a little bit of shadowboxing. I talked about performing a benefit. You're asking, do you know what the benefit is? Are you lying? Are you fooling yourself? And so on and so on. That's not relevant to the point we're making now. If you really got a benefit, then you really have a moral debt. Right? Nobody says they like it in Mitzrayim. Nobody pretends that. If they do, they're not part of our tradition. Nowhere does it say that.
We had it at a point where they said, we had a few mafarshim on it that were saying that, they meant when they were in Mitzrayim and they didn't have to make brachas there, and also when they told Moshe, for what did you take us out of Mitzrayim for? Were there not enough graves there? There's a few... That's
not the same as saying we liked it. It's saying that there was a feature there. Not everything was totally black. Not that we liked it there. Would you volunteer to go back there? Not. When they want to go back to Egypt, it's because they're going to take over. Excuse me, the Egyptian army is broken. They're not going back to be slaves. That's a complete misreading of the text. They're going back to take over. There's a confirmation that. Okay, so now I want to give you another example of a moral principle, because I said there are more, and how the moral principle works to deliver authority to God. To introduce this in a psychologically neutral way, I'm going to give you a parable. You're hiking through the forest. The San Bernardino Mountains, an hour east of Los Angeles. And you've been hiking for 5 hours, up and down, low mountains and valleys and so on and so on. And then it's like May, and you come across some fruit trees. That's interesting. Some fruit trees. And some of them have ripe fruit on them. Apples and pears. Wow, I've been hiking for 5 hours. This is great. This is wonderful. Right here in the forest. So you pick down a few of them and you eat them and you have a bag, you put some in the bag for the rest of your walk. And then you hear a thrashing, crashing through the underbrush of the forest, and somebody comes out and says, "Stop, thief! Stop stealing my fruit!" Are you okay? Should we get the guys in the white coats? Your fruit? This is the middle of the forest. He says, "You came through my fence, and I have signs that say no trespassing." And you think, I'm getting the psychos here. This guy's absolutely nuts. And he says, "Come with me. Show me how you came in." So you go back on the path, come to a certain point, and he says, "They took down my fence!" Oh man, I hope this guy's not armed. I don't know what he's going to do next. He says, "Walk with me." Now he takes you at right angles to your path, and 50 yards down the way, there's a fence, no trespassing. The fence stretches off into the distance. Now he says, turn around 180 degrees, go the other way, passing the point where you were at before. He goes 50 yards the other direction, fence, sign, no trespassing. Somebody has removed 100 yards of his fence. He's dead right. He's dead right. You're on his land. What do you do now? Well, I think the first thing you do is you give him the bag, right? The bag that has his fruit in it. Okay, so I see, you're right. You see, I didn't have any ill intent. I walked through the hell of the fence. It's not my fault, but on the hand, the fruit is your fruit. I agree to that. Oh, by the way, I ate a few. Maybe I should pay you for them because they're his fruit, you see. And you can't do that to somebody else's property. You just can't do that. This is the independent principle of property. I ask how something becomes property. There's John Locke's example, which I won't do now unless you press me. That means that property gives the owner certain authority how the thing that he owns shall be used. That's a moral principle that applies to this guy in the forest and intellectual property, if there is such a thing, at the airspace over my house. It applies to property wherever property exists. Now, there are lots of questions about what makes something someone's property, but one thing's for sure, the paradigm case of property is if you created something out of nothing, then it's definitely yours. There are no competitors. Okay, that would mean that God is the owner of the universe because he creates it out of nothing. Now, just to make things smooth and easy, I'm going to put human beings aside. Maybe human beings can't be owned. Don't want to fight that battle. And slavery, the whole thing. So let's put it on the side. But the stones and the clouds and the airspace and the gravity and wherever you want, all the rest of that stuff, God owns it because he creates it out of nothing. Well, if he owns it, then he has certain moral authority to determine how it shall be used. So, when God says to Jews, you're not allowed to eat pork, you could translate what he's saying is this: they're my pigs. I create them, I make them, they're mine. If you eat pork, you're stealing from me. Because I, as owner, have the authority to tell you not to eat it. So the moral principle of property gives God certain moral authority. And again, things that look like just rituals become morally binding rules because God has that authority. So that's the hybrid answer to the Euthyphro problem. The hybrid answer is saying it's all God's love that makes it evil is incorrect. Saying that all moral rules are just completely independent of God's preferences and commandments is also incorrect. Some moral rules are independent, and they, because of God's activities, give him moral authority, just as they give people moral authority also, because of the way that they behave. And then God sometimes uses that moral authority to issue new rules, which now are binding because he issued them, because he has the moral authority, which he got from the independent moral rules. That's the hybrid picture, yeah.
I'm not debating whether or not God owns us, because he created us as a person, but what is this somethingness and nothingness that Hashem created out of us?
Oh, I didn't use the words that way. I was afraid when I said it was going to perhaps raise it. When we say that God created the world out of nothing, this does not mean there's a something called nothing, and that nothing has its own character, and it weighs 16 pounds, and it's made of cotton balls, and so forth and so on, and that's what he used to make it out. It's like somebody says, you threw a party, who came? And he says, nobody came. And he says, oh, nobody came? What did he drink? And what did he eat? How long did he stay? Because nobody came, right? No. Nobody came means it is not the case that anybody came. Nobody isn't the name of someone who came. Nobody is just a denial that anybody came. So when you say God created the world out of nothing, word N-O-T-H-I-N-G is not the name of the stuff that he created it out of. It means that there wasn't anything before, and then all of a sudden there was stuff with nothing prior to it. That's what it means.
Right. But
something.
Yes, that's true. But this is taped, so you can go back and check the vocabulary. I said at least 3 times I used the present tense, not past tense. He's creating the universe. We spoke about this the other day when we talked about life and death. We talk about God commanding A to kill B, and thinking of whether that's murder or not. And I said life is a continuous gift. You're alive not because you came into existence and you didn't die in between. You're alive because God is giving you life all the time. And I made the example of taking electricity from somebody else's apartment, and then he's decided to stop that. So that's true for the existence of tables also. It's true for the existence of mountains also. God is we say this twice in the prayers after Baruch Hu in the morning, that God is mechadesh tomid ma'aser bereshis. He's making anew the work of creation continuously. So there's nothing there other than what He makes to be.
So it's life itself that is. So God owns us as individuals the same way He owns the table.
But I'm not saying that because there are people who think that human beings are not the kind of thing that can be owned. It's inherently immoral to own a human being. The independence of the human being is his essence. Isaiah Berlin talked like this, and that if you compromise his independence, then you're violating his humanity, and that's an infinite crime against him, and therefore morality wouldn't tolerate that. Although I don't remember him writing it in these words, but I think he would have said even for God, people cannot be owned. So I don't want to fight that battle. I think it's enough to recognize that if God owns everything else, He has the moral authority to determine, within certain limits, He has the moral authority to determine how those things shall be used, which means when He tells us not to eat pigs, that becomes a moral responsibility not to eat pigs. Now I say within certain limits because, and Jesus recognized these limits, suppose all I have to eat is pigs and I'm going to die if I don't eat them. Then the Torah says you should eat them. So God didn't require following the dietary law by dying. Whether He could have or couldn't have is another question. I don't want to go into that either. These details don't touch the principle that I'm working with. The principle is the independent moral principle of the morality of property delivers to God ownership, because His creating the world out of nothing is the most paradigm case of ownership, and that gives Him the moral authority of owner, and that moral authority gives Him the authority to make certain rules with respect to the things that we use, which aren't independently grounded in morality. They're grounded only indirectly. The independent morality gives Him authority, He exercises the authority, and then these things become morally binding. So if someone was worried in the Euthyphro problem that if it's independently grounded, then God has no moral authority, and we look at God as a moral authority, so that sounds like it's a mistake. It's a mistaken picture. That's only because you're taking the extreme position that all morality is independently grounded. That would deprive God of all moral authority, but it doesn't work that way. Okay, so that's the yeah.
The rabbi had mentioned that kind of, if the rabbi didn't mind going to this topic, but owning people is completely immoral, right? Is that what the
So I'm saying there are people who believe that. I don't want to fight that battle with them right now. I'm not saying this immoral. I'm saying they believe that, like Isaiah Berlin and other people like him, and I don't want to fight that battle now to make the point that I want to make.
Okay.
And I don't need to do that. I'm not going any further than that. Yeah.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
Couldn't we say that the ritual morality is just an outgrowth, as you said, of the moral morality, and then we just shift the question up to the moral morality, that those can be separated? First, you just collapse the ritual into the moral reality, and then you just say that you can separate the moral reality out from God as well. Wouldn't that be an issue?
Not as well. Well, no, I don't see why. Why? Well, the objection I'm facing is we understand that God gives commands, and His giving them makes them right. And if all morality is independent of God, then His commands can't make something right. And we do treat it that it does make it right. And the answer is that independent morality gives Him the authority to make commands. Okay. So now, having said that, with like 7 minutes left, I'll tell you what where property comes from. John Locke has this example, which I think is very convincing. And of course, everything in philosophy is controversial. Now, you have to think yourself back 350 years ago. There were large stretches of earthly geography which weren't under the control of any human being or any human entity. Today, every square inch is within the boundaries of one nation or maybe two or three nations. But wasn't like that. So let's imagine George, strolling along like Johnny Appleseed. He's strolling along with his bag of wheat, and he comes to a beautiful valley, totally uninhabited. Nobody's ever been there. He discovered the valley. And he plants the wheat, and it grows to a new crop. And the crop is plentiful, and he harvests it, grinds it into flour, and he makes a dough, puts it in the oven, he bakes it, and he takes it, this takes him 8 months, he puts it out on the table to cool. And then it happens. The masked man with a black horse wearing a black costume rides up, and he takes out his basket, he puts the bread in the basket, and he rides off chuckling evilly into the sunset. What about poor George? Everything okay now? No problems? I don't think so. George has been victimized. The masked man stole George's bread, didn't he? Well, how did it get to be George's bread? There's no community, no nation, no laws, no political entity, no government, nothing. Just George and the land and his bag of wheat. So Locke says, you see here that a completely natural process can be the grounding of a moral quality of ownership. It's not conventional. It's not societal. It's not subjective. It's not a matter of human decisions or coordination or utility. It's just George and the land. He talks about George mixing his labor with the land. Well, that's kind of mysticism, I think. But this is the example that when you look at this and you agree, yeah, the masked man shouldn't do that. That's not right. He's not right. He shouldn't have done that because he stole George's bread. If you have that intuition, you are agreeing that property is an independent moral quality. I said this in Rabbi Shimon Shkup yesterday. I didn't elaborate on where it would come from. I don't know if he read John Locke. He just said that property is before the prohibition against stealing. So that being the case, property is an independent moral idea, and then the prerogatives that the owner has for the things that are his property is an independent moral idea, and those independent moral ideas give God the authority to issue commands which become morally binding because he issued them because they're based on the authority he has as owner. So again, God has now the authority to issue commands and they become morally binding. Now, I haven't done a survey of all possible independent moral principles and how much more authority they give to God. I told you that in our sources, I started with that today, that the authority is not unlimited. That you see from Abraham and Sodom and Gomorrah vis-a-vis God. But there are other moral principles, like acting for the sake of maximum benefit. There is a certain appropriateness, a certain moral preference, let's put it that way, because it's a worry about obligation versus supererogation. There's a certain moral preference for acting in such a way as to create benefit for people. The more benefit, the better. If you know that a certain agent acts to maximize human benefit, that gives a certain moral authority to what he does, because acting for the benefit. So now, if you know that that's where it's coming from, and God gives an order, so then that could also be a way in which the order becomes morally binding. And there may be others as well. It would be a wonderful PhD thesis to try to make a list of the agreed upon independent moral principles, and then apply them to how God relates to the world, and then try to summarize and give a general description of the type of moral authority that God has that's behind the commands that he issues. I think that would make a wonderful PhD thesis and a wonderful book in philosophy. I don't know if anybody's done it. I don't think so. I probably would have heard about it if somebody had done it. Anyway, so this is the answer, one way to answer this problem, which people will throw at traditional Judaism. You haven't got a coherent way to relate morality to God. And one backbone of the complaint will be the Euthyphro problem, and I think we do have a way to do it. Let me tell you finally, because I have a minute left, I'll tell you where I saw it in John Stuart Mill, but I Googled it and I couldn't find it. John Stuart Mill was a utilitarian. And a utilitarian says roughly what I just said 90 seconds ago. Your actions should be to maximize benefit. In his case, it was pleasure over pain. And somebody accused him of being an atheist because in his description of what you ought to do, he didn't mention God. So Mill said, you're making a mistake. I'm not an atheist, I'm neutral. Nothing I say denies that there's a God. What I say is, even if there is no God, there is morality because you're obligated to do what maximizes benefit or maximizes pleasure over pain. But if there is a God, he said, his pleasure and pain also count. He's just another thing in the universe which contributes to the moral conclusion. Now, I don't know if he went this far, but you could go this far. And maybe his pleasure and pain is infinite, and our pleasure and pain is finite. So his pleasure and pain swamps our pleasure and pain. And according to my principle, it's only what he wants. My principle is independent of whether there is a God or not. It's not atheistic, it's neutral. So I thought to myself, aha. So you see that he has a principle of morality, but given who God is and given what his character is, he links into Mill's principle of morality, and then comes out that he determines what's right and wrong. I saw the hybrid in that picture. I just adapted the hybrid to our case. That's all. So I do believe that it's Mill's contribution, but I can't find it. I tried to look at his letters, and I couldn't find it. Maybe one of you will find it, or somebody who's seeing the video will find it and send it to me. I would love to have it. Yeah.
So it's possible that Hashem is at the nexus of all moral principles, and if you play them out, then it kind of just maximizes to his authority in some ways, similarly to how it did in terms of like pain and pleasure.
I think that's right. In other words, if you did it with gratitude, surely the gratitude that I have to God swamps the sum total of all other gratitude that I have from any other sources.
Right.
So if I'm using the principle of gratitude to determine where authority lies, it's all going to be with God. Unless, I shouldn't say quite like that. His authority will swamp other authorities, but it could be things on which God is neutral, and then the moral authority of somebody else who's benefited me will determine what I should do in that case. So it isn't as if it erases other authority, but in any conflict, his authority will swamp anybody else's authority. That certainly could be the outcome. I think that's what I got from Mill, and this is how I'm using it. Okay, it's been wonderful to teach you. It's been a wonderful several months. We've been working together. I hope you have a wonderful vacation. I also will be on vacation in Hashem. I'll be back, I guess, in 3 weeks. When the news month starts.